It's been a while since I've talked about nutrition, especially spring nutrition. It's getting to the time where we're in the middle of starvation season. This is when your bees starve. It wasn't from November until January, February. It was from February on until we get good nectar flows, usually around the 1st of April or so. So, like I said, bees are most likely to starve right now. Brood rearing, we actually saw cat brood. I saw the first cat brood on February 7th is when I first saw the first cat brood this year, which is really early. Usually it's about a week later than that. But brood rearing is calorie and protein intensive. When they start rearing brood, it takes a lot of energy to feed the brood, and it also takes a lot of energy to keep the brood warm. So we start really burning through our energy then. So we need to maintain the weight of our hives. We need to be going and checking the weight of our hives. Even if it's cold out, it's not going to hurt the bees if you walk up behind the hive and tip it to feel how heavy it is. You're much better off to take the few minutes to check the hive and to feed the hive than to let the bees starve. So, why do you need to feed more in the spring? The number one reason other than starvation is brood stimulation. If you want to get these bees built up in time for the nectar flow, the problem we have around here is we have pollen coming in right now. We have the silver maples are blooming, we've got dandelions, we've got crocuses, we've got several different sources of pollen, natural pollen right now. But on days like today, they can't fly to go get pollen, they can't fly to go get nectar. So they're still consuming a lot, and it might be 3 or 4 days, sometimes a week, in between opportunities to go forage. So we want to be able to stimulate this brood rearing, but we can easily overstimulate. If we overstimulate, if we get this pollen substitute on too early, or if we start feeding sugar syrup too early, we can actually overstimulate, cause the brood nest to enlarge too much, and then when we have a cold snap, then the bees can't maintain the temperature for that brood, and it can cause us some other problems. So we don't want to overstimulate them. We want to support them enough with carbohydrates and protein, but again, we don't want them to get too big for the temperatures yet. So carbohydrates, those are going to be your sugars. That's the main source of energy for the bees. The bees need this more than anything else. They can make do without protein sources, but if they run out of sugar sources, they're going to starve to death and die. If you concentrate on any one thing, concentrate on feeding sugar right now, because that's going to be the main thing that keeps your bees alive. Be careful with additives. You want to use simple sugars. Any kind of additives sometimes can cause dysentery. I've seen guys discuss where they tap maple trees. They'll take the maple sap where it's got a really low sugar content and they'll feed it back to the bees, but that'll cause dysentery in the bees because of the solid and the ash content in the maple sap. So you want to be really, really careful with any kind of additives, because if the bees can't make regular cleansing flights, they can't go evacuate their gut, and then that can cause dysentery where they have to go and they just come out of the hive enough to go on the front of the hive and then crawl back in. Also, liquid feed can get too cold for the bees to consume, and you may have to move to fondant or dry sugar. That may be the best option depending on how cold the nights are and how warm the days are. Right now, we're still doing a little bit of fondant and dry sugar, but we're probably going to switch over to sugar syrup here in the next week or two. When you're feeding sugar syrups, you've got two different options with feeding sugar syrups. You can get a pre-mixed sugar syrup like Pro Sweet. What's the other one that's out there? There's another one out there now, isn't there?
I don't know. Pro Sweet's the...
I know Hilco just released one. Pro Sweet's the big one. Pro
Sweet's got mononomial and binomial sugars.
Yeah.
And you can feed it straight at any point of the year instead of worrying about a 1-to-1, 2-to-1.
Mm-hmm. But
it's synthetic nectar.
Yeah. It's the sugars have already been inverted. So when the bees go take natural nectar and they put it in their stomachs, they add an enzyme to it called invertase, which inverts the sugars, which makes them easier to break down. And that's what your honey is. It's actually inverted sugars. So when they invert those sugars, it makes it easier for them to digest. And this has already been inverted, so it's easier for them to digest. You can water it down. I recommend that you water it down in the spring because the bees need water. If you ever watch a bee take honey, honey is actually a little bit too thick. They actually prefer it thin. And in the wintertime, they'll actually take the moisture and the condensation from the inside of the hive and add that to the honey to bring it down to a more normal sugar content. If you watch your bees the last few days when it's warm, all the bees were all over water. I don't care in my yard, anywhere where there was water standing still from the rains and stuff like that. I had bees in buckets, I had bees on top of things. drinking water. They need the water to be able to break down the sugars, and they can't feed the really highly concentrated sugars to the brood. So you need to make, it's probably a good idea to water these down, even though they say you can't feed it straight, but the bees are gonna need water for that. The other thing you can do is mix your own 1-to-1 sugar syrup. Sugar is expensive right now. Sugar is about $1 a pound. So if you go to the Walmart or wherever and buy a bag of sugar, it's gonna be kind of costly. So we recommend mixing it 1-to-1, which would be 8 pounds of sugar to a gallon of water, or a 10-pound bag of sugar to a gallon of water. That's going to be close enough. You don't have to heat it to mix it 1-to-1, but if you go stronger, you will have to heat it, but it won't store long. If you leave it out in the sun or out in room temperatures, 1-to-1 sugar syrup is going to ferment. So you got to keep it cold. You got to keep it refrigerated if you're going to store it for a long time. So don't mix up or don't cut this down any more than what you need to, because if you cut it down and then leave it sit for a long time, you're going to come back and it's going to be alcohol.
Chris, how do you cut down the Pro Suite? I know we've been doing that. So.
Yeah, so when I cut down the Pro Suite, we use a lot of jar feeders, but if I'm going to cut down Pro Suite to get to a 1-to-1 ratio, it's almost 50-50 to cut this down into 1-to-1. That's just a little over a 1-to-1 ratio. It's like a 1.25. If you want to get to a true 1-to-1, it's like right around 1/3 Pro Suite to 2/3 water. If you look at your mason jars, you can kind of judge the 2/3 to the 1/3, but it makes your Pro Suite go a lot farther, because Pro Suite isn't cheap either, but it actually will make your Pro Suite go a lot further, and I think the bees will take it up a little bit quicker if you do break it down a little bit and thin it down.
So Chris, do you use the dry sugar just while it's below freezing?
Yeah, so we're still using dry sugar. We're using combination of fondant patties and dry sugar, and I'll explain that when I talk a little bit more about dry sugar. But we're using the Hive Alive patties that we got with the group buy, and then we're also using dry sugar. The problem is when it gets really, really cold at night, the syrup gets cold, and then the bees can't take the syrup. If the bees try to take the syrup when it's cold, they can chill, and not a lot of times inside the hive it doesn't affect them as much, but a lot of times they won't touch it if it's too cold. So if you get a bag of, if you use a frame feeder or a top feeder or something like that, a frame feeder, the disadvantage of it is if it's cold and they're clustering, they can't get over here to it, because the cluster is going to be might be right up against it, but they can't get down inside the frame feeder to get to it. Same with a top feeder. If the top feeder's on top of them, they have to be able to get up to it and then pass it back down, and they want to be in that tight cluster. That's the advantage of the dry sugar or the fondant, is they'll cluster right up to the top of the frames and right on the bottom of that sugar, and they can eat that dry sugar or that fondant while they're clustered. So that's one of the advantages of candy brick or dry sugar, is they can eat that and they can maintain themselves while they're clustered, where they can't get to the sugar syrup.
Do you sometimes go back and forth, like we're in March, it might be above freezing, and then next week it's below freezing? Do you
So
go back and forth, or once you start doing
once we start feeding sugar syrup, we'll be full on sugar syrup. But we usually wait until we have more consistent nighttime temperatures and more consistent daytime temperatures. Like today, we had some bees out flying, but they weren't flying enough to go forage. They were just going out, looked like doing cleansing flights and back in the hive. But the other day, they were on top of anything that they could find that was water, or anything that they could find that they thought was a sugar source or a pollen source. We noticed them in the neighbors' bird feeders. If you've got chicken feed right now and you got chicken feed out and it's warm enough, you'll notice the bees are in your chicken feed trying to find any protein source that they can. But water and sugar are going to be their main things. That's what's going to keep them alive. So what to feed the dry sugar? We do the mountain camp method. Basically, you need a shim of some sort or an empty box. We're going to place a piece of newspaper on top of the frames. We're going to place our shim or our extra box on top of there, and then we're going to pour anywhere from 5 to 10 pounds of dry sugar. The advantage of the dry sugar is not only is it an emergency feed source, but if you've ever left sugar out in a moist environment, what's the sugar do? It absorbs all that moisture. So right now the problem we have is we're going to have cold nights, and then we could have damp, rainy days. So we're going to put excess moisture in our hives. So that also acts as a moisture sink to pull some of that moisture out, because bees can tolerate the cold, but if they get wet and cold, that's what will kill them. So we want to make sure that we stay away from getting our bees wet. So by adding the dry sugar, that dry sugar will actually suck up some of that moisture and help keep your bees from getting wet, and also provide them with supplemental food. You can get the fondant patties. I I've got a Hive Alive patty out in the car if you haven't seen one. There's the Day Day Winter patty, which is actually a sugar patty, and it has a small amount of protein. I think it's like 2 to 5% protein. And then Man Lake has a Pro Winter feed that's in a bucket that you basically, it's a fondant that you scoop out. And you just place a fondant patty on top of the frames. You can actually, Alan Moran, he went one year and he bought fondant from a cake decorator and put it on there. You want to stay away from stuff with a lot of food coloring and stuff like that. They don't really recommend the fondant from cake decorators because it has cornstarch in it, which can cause dysentery if they can't get out on regular cleansing flights. But if you're in a pinch and you can get it cheap, then that's a good sugar source. Sugar bricks, there's clubs that actually get together on a weekend and they'll make a bunch of sugar bricks. Basically, you're making hard candy. So if you've ever made like the hard rock candy, you boil it, you use a candy thermometer, you bring it up to hard tack, and then you let it cool, you pour it into molds and let it cool, and you got this big block of sugar. And what they'll do is they'll make a lid that's got a rim on it, like a shim, and then they'll put chicken wire or something else in there, and then they'll pour that hot sugar syrup in there, and it'll bind to that wire, and then they can flip it upside down and put it on the hive. That way they can take it off easier. So when you want to go inspect your hive, you just lift that up and it takes a sugar brick off of it with it. Or you can just set the chunks of sugar on top of there.
Can you mix those three methods?
We're doing a combination of fondant because we still had fondant patties on some hives. We were having a little bit of moisture in a couple of our locations where they're in a valley. So we actually put Mountain Camp on top of it to control the moisture, and they've got the fondant on there still.
Chris,
Yes.
on the sugar, I was into a guy's hive because the bees would come out top, not the bottom.
Yeah.
And so he did the sugar thing with newspaper, but I think he had all the sugar in the front. Because once we dug down in, there was 2-3 inches of sugar at the entrance, and the bees couldn't get out.
Yeah. So you need to make sure at least a single layer of newspaper works best. Some people will put a double layer of newspaper. In a pinch, when I haven't had newspaper, I've used like craft paper. Everybody gets a bunch of craft paper in their Walmart packages anymore. It's all wadded up in there as shipping material. You can use that craft paper in a pinch. Just something that the bees can chew through, and it gives that sugar a chance to harden up. So usually what I do is I don't fill this completely up all the way to the top when I'm putting Mountain Camp on. I'll usually like start in the back and fill to the front, and then I'll leave this area with no sugar and just see newspaper. And that allows the bees to come up through this area. They'll break through that newspaper really, really quick, and then they can get to the sugar. And you'll see it, and I think I got some pictures here. I had pictures of there's a dry sugar feed. So you can see the newspaper is here in the front, and I poured the sugar in the back, and then they broke through here first and started eating it. Eventually the newspaper will completely disappear, and all you'll be left with is the sugar, and it'll be solid as a rock. This one's a shim, and then this one's just an extra box. So carbohydrates, you've either got to do a syrup, or again, if it's too cold, you can do some sort of dry sugar or fondant, but you've got to keep carbohydrates on them. This is what's going to cause your bees to starve to death. The bees can actually live a long time with no honey left in the hive if you keep sugar on them and you keep putting it on them on a regular basis until the nectar flow starts, or until you can start feeding them some sort of sugar syrup. Protein. If you start putting protein on, it's going to stimulate brood rearing. When the bees notice protein coming in, whether it's natural protein or protein that you're putting in, they see that protein source is coming in, and they're going to want to automatically start building up brood because they think that they're behind and they need to get moving. There's a lot of different formulations. It can come in a dry powder or a patty. Some of these can contain probiotics. All of them, if you look at the front of them, are going to have a crude protein analysis on it. Like this one, crude protein not less than 15%, crude fat not less than 6%. So you can kind of compare how much protein you're actually giving your bees. You can also look and see what they're using for a protein source. This one's using plant protein products. It's got a little bit of fructose in it, some grain byproducts. but most of these are going to be plant-based. They're going to be either soy-based or corn-based, but most of them are soy-based. They are a small hive beetle attractant, so once we get warm and the bees are actually no longer eating the protein patty, you want to get it off as soon as you can, because the small hive beetles will take over that, and then they'll end up making a mess out of your hive. There was a recent University of Florida study. They put UV dye in a bunch of different protein supplements to see which bees were taking it and how they were utilizing it. So they put UV dye into this protein substitute and put it in the hives in the spring. And what they found was the adult bees were taking the protein substitute, but they were not feeding the protein substitute to the larvae. The thought is that the adult bees are using the protein substitute to be able to stimulate their hypopharyngeal glands so they can produce the royal jelly, but they're using actual real protein that's in the hive or protein that or pollen that they're harvesting to feed the larvae. They've got some more studies that now that they've done the initial study, that they're working on to try to figure out what they're actually feeding and how the larvae are actually able to survive without the protein. But it's kind of an interesting, if you ever listen to the Two Bees in a podcast from University of Florida, there's an episode on it where they talk about where they did this study and they actually found that the bees were not feeding any kind of protein substitute to the larvae, which that's what we always thought. We always thought that the bees were using this as a replacement for bee bread. So we don't know exactly what the bees are doing or how they're doing it, but they know that based off of a larval dye or a UV dye that they're not feeding it to the larva. Some people, if you can track your own pollen and freeze it and feed it back to the bees, most of your pollens most of the protein that you buy from your bees is a pollen substitute. Very little of it contains actual pollen, because any trapped pollen can contain American foul brood spores. So it is a transmission route for disease. But if you want to trap your own and feed it back to your bees, there's recipes online that you can trap your own pollen with pollen traps and then actually freeze it, and then in the wintertime you can make your own pollen patties and feed it back. And just do your homework. Find out what you like, what works best for you. Ask other beekeepers in the area, what are you using, what do you like, and what works for you. But there's a lot of recipes that you can make these pollen substitutes on your own. And there's also recipes, a bunch of different recipes for different things that you can do for carbohydrate feed. How to feed in the spring. Dry sugar or fondant until the temperatures are regularly above freezing. We still have some really cold nights ahead of us. I don't know who believes the Euro model or what forecast model, but some of them say our biggest snow is yet to come. You just don't know. So if you start feeding too early, or if you switch, it could cause starvation. Kind of the rule that I use is I wait until I see a good nectar flow coming in before I start pulling off my dry sugar. That dry sugar, when you put it on, or that fondant, you can pull it off, do your inspections, and put it right back on. It doesn't hurt to leave it there up until a good nectar flow is happening. Once a good nectar flow is happening, the bees see it as garbage and will take it out and dispose of it. But usually by that time, they've worked it down to nothing. Sugar syrups. Some hive feeders will help keep the sugar syrup warmer than entrance feeders or top jars. So if you're using lid feeders or bucket feeders on top of your hive, those might get a lot colder in the night and take up a little bit more time to warm up. But if this frame feeder is right beside your cluster, then it's going to stay warm a little bit longer, and the bees might be able to access it a little bit sooner than what they could a top feeder or any kind of outside feeder like an entrance feeder or a jar feeder. Sometimes though, the jar feeders, they can get a little bit warmer on sunny days. I used to do this when I first started to kind of keep a track of when the nectar flows were occurring, and when I saw more nectar coming in than sugar syrup being used, I would put a few drops of green or blue food coloring in my sugar syrup just so I knew, just to learn the nectar flows and the timing of stuff, so I could learn to follow that. So here's the dry sugar, we talked about that. The newspaper, you can actually see, I think that's the crossword puzzle down here. If the bees want to do it, they get bored. But just, like I said, pour it on one end and work your way up and leave them some space on this end. And then they'll eat it, and at the end of the season on these hard bricks, I just take them and collect those bricks of hard sugar, put them in a 5-gallon bucket, put a lid on them, and I'll save them for next year. And they'll keep in your garage or in your building or anything else, because they're pretty dry and pretty hard by that point. This is the food coloring. So this is when I use baggie feeders, and these are a very viable feeder. Again, it's right close to the cluster, but if it's really cold, they have to climb up on top of this bag. But they're going to be able to keep that warmer because heat rises, and it's going to come right up directly on that syrup. But if you look over here, you can actually see where it's green, and then you get down into here, and it's actually natural nectar. So you could watch and see when this green started being outpaced by natural nectar, and when you started seeing a lot of natural nectar coming in, then you knew that you could pull this feed and let them actually do what they wanted to. The other thing is, I knew that I wasn't going to be selling any kind of sugar syrup as honey. Dry pollen substitute, you didn't bring any of that, did you?
No, I don't have it.
Okay, so dry pollen substitute, these are usually open fed. There's a bunch of different types of feeders on the market. There's ones that take 10 to 15 pounds that are these blue feeders that are usually for a large bee yard. You want to make sure that you're open feeding very, very close to your bees. Your bees aren't going to travel very far to find things right now, so you want to make sure that you're close. A lot of guys will also build these out of some PVC pipe and fittings. If your dry substitute gets wet, it gets hard and it gets moldy really, really quick. So you want to make sure if you've got it out, that you protect it from the weather or protect it from the rain. And again, if the bees aren't flying, they can't access this. So this is basically becomes useless to them once they're flying. And they seem to turn from this really, really quickly once natural pollen is coming in. They seem to go away from it as soon as the natural pollen's coming in. This is one of the feeders that a lot of people will build. It's just a piece of Schedule 40 PVC pipe. Actually, I think it might be Schedule 80. A cap and then a rain gutter. And then they'll put this in there, and it's protected from the weather, and the bees can get in there and get to it, and it stays dry. This is dry pollen feeding. Pollen patties. I'm not going to open this, but they're a flat patty. I didn't want to open it for the whole thing.
Well, if someone wants the whole thing, then they can buy the whole thing. It's not gonna hurt to be it open. I figured Rick would probably buy it. Ooh, if it wasn't open. That's how it goes around. I hear you.
So these are usually bound together with some sort of sugar, some sort of really thick, almost like I don't know, it's not quite a fondant, but it's bound together with a sugar. You can cut these down, you can cut them in half, cut them in quarters, or use whatever size that you want. The bees will consume the paper and the patty. Sometimes it might take them a little bit longer to consume the paper. And once natural pollen is available and it's abundant, they'll disregard these. And these are what the small hive beetles like, and they can make a mess. So you want to monitor this and make sure that the bees are still using it. And as soon as they're not, you want to get it off your hive. I like to do smaller and more frequent feedings. So we usually feed our full-size hives. We do a half a patty, and then our 5-frame nukes will do a quarter of a patty. And then we're back every week checking to make sure that if they need more, we'll go ahead and put more on. And if they don't need it, then we're just going to move on and look for sugar, make sure they've got enough sugar.
That's very good advice.
Yeah.
I tell people when they buy them, we don't have a pollen issue here 99% of the time. And putting a whole one on there is going to cause you more trouble with ants and hive beetles and every other thing that wants that sweetness than what the bees really need.
Yeah.
What kind of shelf life does that have?
If you freeze it indefinite.
Yeah.
I don't know what the expiration date on that case is.
I don't even see one unless it's on the other side.
It might be, but yeah, I keep them, the ones at the shop, and I bet you know, we don't sell a whole lot of that just because Chris knows too, I turn people off of it more than anything. But I keep it in the freezer. And like that's a 1 pound right there in his hands. So, you know, there's 4 10-pound sections in that case.
And again, we just feed it as needed.
And you can freeze it if you take it off the hive. Let's say you put a half in there and they only eat a quarter of it. Go throw it in your freezer. As long as you get it right in the freezer, then it's ready to be used again. Do not ever put that type of patty on in the winter time.
No.
Because it makes them want to start making brood.
Usually if you want to put something like this on, if you want to stimulate a bunch of brood rearing, Valentine's Day. get it on around Valentine's Day. That'll stimulate them before the first pollen's coming in. The first pollen we usually see around the end of February, 1st of March, but we don't see abundant pollen usually until the middle or late March. So they'll eat this from Valentine's Day up until middle or late March is when they'll take this. And then they're just going to ignore it after that. And these just become small hive beetle magnets, and I've opened hives before, and these are just a mess full of small hive beetles. Because the bee population is still down, they're still building up, they don't have a lot of time to defend stuff, they can still have to cluster at night, so that's when the small hive beetles can really make a mess of these. And again, refrigerate or freeze these to maintain the nutritional value. They've got a normal shelf life at room temperature around 3 years.
Probably, yeah.
But if you freeze them, they will last a long time.
And can I say one more thing about those? If you're wanting to make bees, okay, and doing a lean split, that's really a great tool to have. That's who I would promote those to, because it lets those workers stay in that hive a lot more. Same thing with sugar syrup on them.
Yeah.
But if you're wanting to grow your colony for honey production or whatever else, just gotta be careful with it, because it's gonna make them start.
There's also some information coming out what turns a winter bee back into a normal bee and turns that clock back on.
Right.
Because you remember your winter bees are born usually in October and they last the entire winter. And they found that when the pollen quits flowing in the winter or in the fall, that's when the bees really start raising winter bees in earnest. That's when they do their largest batch of winter bees, is when the pollen stops. And then when the pollen starts again, that starts that 40-day clock. So when you start putting pollen on, that starts that 40-day clock that worker is going to be alive for. And so when you start putting this pollen sub on, you're actually going to start that clock, and those workers that have been in there for 3 or 4 months are going to start timing out really, really quickly. So you've got to make sure that you can brood up enough and you time it right. So using these is a really big timing thing.
Yes, and it includes Pro Sweet is what they use as the sugar in that patty. And if you smell it, you can smell the essential oils. That's Pro Health. And so that is a good tool also to kind of help clean that gut out. Coming out of winter time, they get a little of that Pro Health in there, a little probiotic, clean them out, and so that would be also another good use, but small amount.
There are some of these that contain Apis biologics, which is the newest probiotic that's out there. You can actually, I saw where some guy was actually pulling the paper back, and he was sprinkling some of that Apis biologics on here and then putting the paper back on it. If you wanted to do that, if you didn't want to pay for the patties with the Apis biologics in it, if you just wanted to get the powder. Studies are still mixed on whether or not probiotics are actually beneficial to the bees. There's actually some more studies that are in progress right now, so hopefully we'll have a better answer. But if you want to do probiotics, you're going to put it in your pollen. You don't want to put it in your sugar syrup. It doesn't dissolve well in sugar syrup. So you want to put it in some sort of pollen or some sort of patty.
One more tidbit on the Pro patty, on the Ultra Bee patty, and I'll shut up about it. So Man Lake makes another version of this, and I can't remember what it's called. It's like Ultra Bee Pro or Ultimate. It's a lot more expensive.
Isn't it the one they call rocket fuel?
Something like that.
Yeah.
And why it's more expensive is it has real pollen in it. That is all synthetic pollen. There's no real pollen in that pollen patty. It's a pollen sub. So they was really pushing that on me to start selling that, quit selling this. Well, I found out how much pollen was in it. I laughed at it. It's only like 5%. And so I don't think it's worth the extra $30 a case for 5% pollen, because it almost defeats the purpose.
And they're irradiating their pollen, so they're actually using an irradiation process to kill all the American foul brood spores. Yeah, I did read that about because I think it's Daydant and Man Lake both have ones that contain real pollen, but they have to irradiate it to make sure that there's no American foul brood spores. Yeah.
So what's the difference between those and the Hive Alive patties?
The Hive Alive contains no protein. It's just carbohydrates and amino acids. So there's no protein in it. So in order to raise brood, you have to have the protein because the bees have to be able to make they have to be able to activate their hypopharyngeal glands to be able to make their jelly that they feed the brood. And they also, like I said, the studies show that they're not feeding this to the brood, but they might be using this instead of real pollen and feeding the real pollen to the brood. They're still up in the air as to what's going on with that. But this is a pollen and protein as a brood stimulant. So this is to keep your bees from starving, and then you're going to stimulate them to raise more bees.
Well, on the Hive Alive, you put pollen in there at the same time?
You can put both in there at the same time. We've got both in a lot of our hives right now. We've got pollen patties and Hive Alive.
If you want to stimulate them, so you can split them.
Yeah, if you want to stimulate them, so you can split them.
Okay.
Because if you stimulate them with the pollen and there's not enough sugar in there, they're going to starve to death. So you want to make sure if you're going to stimulate with the pollen that you also have carbohydrates in there, either Hive Alive or dry sugar. Looking at the weather forecast, probably next week, they're calling for several days in the 70s next week. You could probably start switching to some sugar syrup next week. The biggest thing with carbohydrates is make sure that you check the hive weights. Even if it's a bad day, it doesn't hurt the bees to go out and lift on the back of that hive. Remember, we want them to weigh, in the wintertime, we want them to weigh about 70, 80 pounds. They're going to be down to about 20, 30 pounds right now. So they're going to be down on weight, but if you can compare and contrast, if you walk down to the hives down here, there's 3 of them that feel really, really heavy and still really stout. And then there's 7 or 8 of them that are you just pick them up, you're like, man, they're a little bit light. When you actually pull the frames out, there's still honey in the frames, there's still pollen in the frames, but they feel lighter than the ones next to them. And that's just because some of the bees have used up more of their sugar. Some of the bees had more sugar. So make sure that you note which ones are light and make sure you're feeding that dry sugar. We usually will keep the dry sugar on until the nectar flow starts in March, which again, if things keep breaking, we've got the silver maples in bloom. The red maples won't be too far behind along with the sugar maples, and then things will just really take off. We're starting to see dandelions out here in the hayfield out here by the bees. We saw dandelions the other day. We're seeing crocuses. So we're seeing stuff start to bloom. It's just a matter of time until the nectar. Don't be afraid to add more sugar or fondant. If you're not sure, it's a good insurance policy. A 25-pound bag of sugar that's $20 at Walmart is way cheaper than losing your bees. I will gladly go buy a bunch of sugar and put it on my bees versus losing them if I've got them this far through winter. Whether I'm mixing up sugar syrup or if I'm putting dry sugar or fondant on, I'd rather spend the money on it than to lose the bees and have to replace the bees. You can open up and check these hives anytime the bees are out flying. I was out here yesterday after church and I went down just to double check a few of them. And a few of them had eaten most of their dry sugar and they were low on Hive Alive, so I added some more pollen substitute, some more dry sugar, and a little bit more Hive Alive patties to a few of them. If you plan to harvest honey, remove your sugar syrup as soon as the nectar flow starts. You don't want to sell your customers sugar syrup. You want to make sure that you're actually selling them honey. So as soon as you know that the nectar flow is really starting, really going on, that's usually around the 1st of April. Usually about the time we see the first swarms is when the nectar flow really starts going. So make sure you remove your sugar syrup or cool your feeders if you're going to harvest honey off of that hive. The powdered pollen substitute. A lot of those guys that will feed this, they actually start feeding this powdered pollen substitute as early as January. Again, I think that in January you're going to stimulate too much brood rearing, and these have to be kept close to the hive. The advantage that the dry pollen powder or the powdered pollen substitute has is you're not putting something in your hive that's going to attract small hive beetles or other pests. So it's not in your hive, you're attracting them away from the hive, but the disadvantage is the bees may not be able to get to it. We're feeding these now, the patties. The bees will consume these when they can't fly, and it doesn't mold and mildew. So even if this gets damp from condensation in your hive, we don't have any issues with the mold and mildewing in them. And again, get them off as soon as the bees start ignoring them. So feeding pitfalls. There's no pitfalls in feeding carbohydrates. There's never a time that I will tell you don't feed a carbohydrate or a sugar. If the bees need it, they will use it. but these have a lot of pitfalls. They can brood up too quickly. You can overstimulate brood rearing. You can stimulate it too early. So be very, very careful with these. And again, failure to remove these can cause a hive beetle infestation so large that it can either slime out the entire hive or cause them to abscond. One of the problems we'll have right now is if our bees start brooding up and we have 4, 5, 6 days when they can't break cluster to go get food, they're not going to abandon their brood. A lot of your bees are very, very attached to that brood, and they won't go and move off of that brood to go get to sugar. So if there's honey right above them, they'll actually starve to death trying to keep that brood warm. So if you get that cluster too big, if you get the number of brood, or the amount of brood too big, too early, then if we get a cold snap, like they're saying 3 or 4 inches of snow or whatever, if that's on for 3 to 4 or 5 days, then that cluster is not going to move up or move sideways to get to that sugar off of that brood. That's the disadvantage of rearing too much brood. The other disadvantage is if the cluster, if they have these nice full frames of brood, and the cluster has to contract, the brood on the outside of the frames is going to get cold and it's going to get chilled and die from cold. And that can be an attractant for stone brood and chalk brood. It's not unusual if we have like a really, really early warm spell in February, and then we have like 2 weeks of cold in March, that you'll see some stone brood or chalk brood where the bees got really big because it was warm. The queen laid up a bunch of stuff, and then they had to contract down, and the edges ended up getting a little bit too cold, and the larva or the pupa died, and the fungus got infected, or the larva got infected with the fungus that causes stone brood or chalk brood. The bees will clean that up on their own. It is an indication that they were oversized and they had to recluster, and the brood got cold. So if you see stone brood or chalk brood.
So if you're a beekeeper and you're just planning on selling honey, you just pretty much stick to carbohydrates. But
Just stick straight to carbohydrates.
If it's gonna split your hive and
Yeah.
sell bees, then that's where you add the pollen.
That's where you're going to add the pollen. Is if you want to grow those bees. Now, if you really, really want to put a lot of honey on, you really want that hive nice and big because you want to get your first supers on as early as possible. But take a couple seasons, especially if you're new, and watch things and learn things before you start messing with the pollen sub. That's what I usually recommend is if you want to do pollen sub, give yourself a season or two to kind of learn the sequence of when the bees are brooding up and as compared to the weather. And then after a season or two, then you can actually start playing with the pollen substitute. And the other thing is if you want to play with it, if you've got 3 or 4 hives, give it to a couple hives and not to others on the pollen and see how they do and compare and contrast your hives with your pollen substitute versus your ones without. That's how I started playing around with it, was I did some without and some with, just to see how they brood up. And then also, I didn't want to do it too early, so you can use that to compare and contrast. Pollen substitute, like you said, if you don't store it properly, if it gets too hot, too dry, it'll end up degrading over time. Any questions? Has anybody got pollen substitute on right now? You guys do?
We did last week.
Mm-hmm.
Just a little bit.
Yeah. Just a little bit,
Little
like
chunk.
half a patty or quarter patty.
Just a little
Half of
chunk.
a patty.
Yeah.
I'll tell you something I learned. Yeah, we'll talk about that later. New math's killing me. Something I learned last year the hard way. My shims, of course, I use furnace strips for shims,
Mhm.
and sometimes a little too much.
Yeah.
If you don't check them regularly, they'll build that thing plumb full of bird
Yeah.
on it before you know it, and they're. So if you keep a check on it.
Yeah, that's the other thing is if you're using a shim, you'll know that the nectar flow's hit because they'll fill this up with comb really, really quick.
Last year I had brood laid up, and it was a mess. Not all of them, but one of them.
Yeah, watch for the nectar flow. You can actually tell the bees will actually, like right now, you can watch them. If you watch the front of your hive, they're going in and out, and you've got a few of them that are going out and foraging. You can actually see them, you can actually watch them, but then most of them are just hanging out on the front, and they're just flying short distances. But you've only got, I'd say probably only maybe 5% of your bees foraging right now. There's not a lot of foragers out. When the activity around the entrances really starts picking up, that's when you know the nectar flow's on. And again, once it's warm enough on warm days, like it's supposed to be what, in the 50s tomorrow and sunny.
68, Channel 6
Six.
is.
Yeah.
They're never wrong.
Yeah, if it's in the 60s and it's sunny out, pull frames, look and see what you've got. Look for that wet nectar. I haven't seen any wet nectar yet, but it's probably just around the corner with the maples blooming. The maples are going to go nuts this week.
And then they
And the dandelions. Just don't let them starve. This is the most precarious time of the year. They can starve really easy. So make sure they've got weight. If they don't have weight, then get some food on them. You can do the Pro Suite. Again, this stuff can be thinned down. This gallon, you can probably make almost 3 gallons out of it. Out of 1 gallon of this.
And what does that sell for?
I don't know, Corey's the one that's,
Yeah, so all this stuff up here that you see, so the Pro Suite's $20 a gallon. I have 5-gallon buckets of it at home. We can sell that for $95. Okay. The protein patties, the whole box of 40 pounds is $95. $35 for 10 pound, or a single patty, $4. The in-frame feeders are $16 each. Okay. So if you need any of that tonight, just holler at me before we leave and take some home with you. But
you have
like
medium
Chris
frame
said,
feeders at the shop.
I
right?
do have medium frame
Yeah.
feeders at the shop, yes. And the Pro Suite, like Chris said, if you take that down 3 times, you know, you get 3 gallons out of that at $20. That's just that's less than $7 a gallon, which is about cheaper than what you could go buy sugar for, and then
Yeah.
putting the mixing into it and all. So,
25-pound bag of sugar with 3 gallons of water, that's a 1-to-1 mix, is gonna cost you $20.
Now, does this spoil?
no, that never spoils.
Does it stay like the high line?
Yes, and another thing you can do.
As long as you don't thin it.
Yeah,
As long as you don't thin this, it'll stay good.
But if you thin it, then.
If you thin it, it'll ferment.
Or you could add, we have what's called Pro Health, okay? And you can add a little bit of Pro Health to your thin syrup, and that will greatly extend its life of fermenting
Yeah.
outside.
Pro Health has a yeast inhibitor in it that actually prevents the yeast that turn the sugar syrup into alcohol, along with essential oils in it. So
Don't eat it right now, don't eat it up, but in them hot days, you know, then really, when they're not taking sugar syrup, that's your sign that says quit giving it, because as soon as that nectar's coming in, they'll leave that. You can have as much of it out there as you want, it won't touch it. And the same goes with the pollen stuff.
yeah.
If you put it in there and there's a bunch of pollen in those frames and they're not touching that patty, get it out.
I do it about 100 yards from my hives.
Mhm.
I got 2 sawhorses. I got 2 buckets. It's got them 4 or 5 holes punched
Yeah.
in the bottom. I just put it on the sawhorses, put it out.
Absolutely.
They
Just let 'em
come
open
go.
feed.
They just come and go.
Yeah.
And typically we do have dry Ultra Bee. I'm just sold that out right now. Sold the last bit of that not too long ago. So we usually keep some of that on hand if you want to
Yeah.
make it. And Randy just made a good point too. You can actually take that Pro Suite right there and mix that with the Ultra Bee dry pollen, and you can even make your own patty.
There's videos online of how to do that.
Just take you some wax paper.
There's the newspaper.
Yeah, or newspaper, and they'll eat right through that. Like that patty there, you don't get rid of that wax. You can just leave that wax paper right on it, throw it in there, they'll eat right through it.
Yeah, there's a lot of videos on how to make your own.
But you know, that 5 gallons of that Pro Suite, I don't know, Chris, what is that stuff? $150 some for Man Lake now?
119.
5-gallon bucket? I don't understand it. And I'm buying it, and I'm making a little bit, and I can sell it to you for under $100 for a 5-gallon bucket.
And pay shipping.
Right, now we've got to pick, yeah, they will not ship that stuff to you free. So,
We started using the Pro Suite last year, and I'm pretty happy with it. We used it for queen rearing, and then we also used it for winter buildup.
he had to twist my arm to to thin it down. I wasn't real,
Yeah, I told him I was gonna thin it down, he looked at me like I had four
I
eyes.
didn't like, cause I didn't want it to go bad.
Mm.
And he said, it's gonna be fine, and I'm glad I listened to him, because it worked out great, and now I do, so.
Yeah. For queen rearing, if you're gonna use Pro Sweet for queen rearing, you have to thin it down. Bees won't rear queens on thick syrup. They have to rear queens on thin syrup. So if you're gonna use it in a cell starter or cell finisher, you do want to thin it down. Most of the guys recommend like a 3-to-1. So you're gonna mix 3 parts water to 1 part this, because for queen rearing and cell builders and cell finishers, you want that really thin syrup, because that's what the bees are looking for. They're looking for something more like nectar than they are honey.
And there's a lot of guys that sell knockoff Pro Sweet.
Mhm.
And that's been something that's really been going on here. Because Chris and I thought about buying 500 gallon of it at once in storage totes, and then I was just going to dispense it right there at the shop. That's the way we can get it as cheap as possible. Then we run some numbers on it, and it's really not worth the savings if I can get it in a 5-gallon bucket for what we're doing. So, but a lot of people say, oh, I got Pro Sweet and I'll sell it to you for whatever, 50 cents a pound, bring your own bucket. And it's not always Pro Sweet. So, I would want to see documentation that they're selling you real Pro Sweet. And there's an Amish guy that I was inspecting over in Pike County, Jackson County line. He told me, oh, I got Pro Sweet. What Pro Sweet? He was driving all the way up to Lake Erie, filling up a tote, bringing it back, thinking he had Pro Sweet. He didn't have Pro Sweet. Basically, he had corn syrup. That's what he had. So there's always people out there that's try to make a quick dollar on you. But that's one of the few things that I really do like as far as feed goes. Is the Pro Sweet is a very good, stable. They put a lot of science into that. They tried to make synthetic nectar for the bees' gut health, and it really is better than mixing sugar water.
Anything else?